Okay. Kia ora, good morning. I'd now like to open the Strategy and Finance Committee meeting Wednesday, 8th of May, and call on Councillor Fitzgerald, if I could, to open with karakia. Ngā mihi.
Tēnā koe, tēnā tātou, ko tai mai nei tēnei ata. Tūtawa mai runga, tūtawa mai raro, tūtawa mai roto, tūtawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tāekie.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Fitzgerald. Just for some housekeeping, explaining that this meeting has been recorded and we live stream to the Council's YouTube channel. The health and safety procedures are on the screen before us, so fire and emergency and our health and safety procedures. Please read through those. All participants online, if you can keep your cameras turned on and your microphones muted, and that's fine. And if there's any issues, please see one of the administrators. Presenters online, just please give your name before speaking. That'll be helpful. We move into the apologies, and I have an apology for the Mayor for early departure on council business. Are there any other apologies? Yes, Councillor Meehan. Do you want to cue yourself? Yep. Yep.
Early departure.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Micallard?
Yes, Mr Chair, early departure in the likely event that we do not finish by 3 on council business. Thank you.
Thank you. Those being included, I'll move those, seconded by our Deputy Chair, Councillor Naylor, and invite a vote. That's passed unanimously, 15 votes for. Item 3 is notification of additional items. I aren't aware of any. Item 4, declarations of interest. Are there any? There being none, that moves us to item 5, public comment, which there is none, and 6 is confirmation of the minutes, page 7 for members. I'm happy to move them, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open up for any matters arising. So I'll move that the minutes of the Strategy and Finance Committee meeting of the 10th of April be moved as a true and correct record, and that's been seconded, and invite a vote. Passed, 13 votes for and 2 abstentions. That moves us on to the quarterly performance financial report, period ending 31st of March, and invite officers to the table. Scott Manser, who is the Finance Manager, Adam Gosney, Program Governance Team Leader, and Andrew Boyle, Head of Community Planning. Welcome.
Good morning all. We'll take the paper largely as read. However, I do have a couple of talking points to run elected members through before we open up for questions. So firstly, we've been sort of tracking, as we've indicated throughout the year. We're continuing to have a couple of pressures, particularly on insurance, electricity related to when the biogas generator was down at the start of the year. That variance, whilst unfavourable, has maintained itself now that that's back online, and contractor spend, particularly in the roading space, is another pressure. Something to note, which is a little bit bigger than previous month, is the variance on non-operating revenues. So this is our capital revenue, and it particularly relates in the large part to the Transport Choices program, especially the Cycleways 1, which has been cancelled. So there's also a resolution about removing that budget as well. That accounts for over half of that variance. And the other piece is the vested assets. We'd phased that budget relatively even and hadn't quite understood the timing of when the new asset module was coming online with Authority Altitude. So that's coming online this month, so we'll do a bit of a catch up. So it's a timing issue, that one. Excuse me, you'll see that we reference in the report that we've done an end of year forecast, and at the moment we're signalling that to be $1.3 million unfavourable. However, we are right this week, actually the organisation and budgeters are completing an update of that forecast. Indications are that we'll improve that a lot closer to zero, and I know ELT keen to make that happen as much as they can, so they're reviewing anything that we can to try and just hold that as close to zero and balance the budget to year end. We have a resolution to council to provide the Chief Executive with some additional delegation for moving between activities. So the one that I've already alluded to is from active and public transport to the roading activity to help alleviate the pressure on the contractor spend there. And the second one is between from stormwater and water to the wastewater activity. We have a couple of operational efficiencies that we've found, and a couple of activities are offset with some slightly higher spend due to that electricity and the biogas being offline earlier. So we're just preemptively getting those approved, and we'll report actual movements through the June 2024 quarter report to council later this year. Finally, from me, before I pass over to the rest of the team, we've included an update on the Better Off funding programs. In between writing the report and today, we've received a letter from Wellington just indicating that they would like us to consider reallocation of some of those fundings towards water and or transition projects. We are just seeking further advice from Wellington on exactly what that would look like, and we're intending to bring that back through the LTP process once we have that information to hand. But it would be good to just give you a heads up about that for later this month. I think that's all from me. We'll take questions shortly, but I'll pass to Adam for a bit of capital program.
Morning all. Yeah, nice to you've probably maybe seen me pop in once or twice, but yeah, nice to actually be up here to speak to you. So yeah, morning. So yeah, Adam Gosney, first time sitting up here. So in replace or in John Atkins' Aiken's seat for this morning. So. Two or three things from a program view in terms of the reporting, or three factors that we're sort of analysing a little further, is when we look at it, there is some variance to budget. That is something that gets heavily analysed each month and particularly each quarter. Within that variance, the budget, there are factors that have been mentioned around the urban cycling network. That's about $4 million around that variance. Some stuff in the transport choices around the bus stops development, which was always looking to be a hockey stick spend, which is happening. There's the multicultural community hub that was actually in the March forecast, but that has looked to have gone through in the April, so it hasn't come through, but it sits in that variance space. And some of the specific projects like around Wyndham Street and a couple others that more council decisions but are sitting within that March variance that's come through in the report. The other factor from a program view that we've really focused upon quite intensely from a governance perspective are in the projects that are not started. So the report does identify 28 projects, that's correct, 28 projects that as of the end of March started yet. So the statistic side of me, so 8 of those are no longer actually required, and so they've been moved into different, those budgets have been moved into different projects. 2 of those projects that have not started are actually based upon growth and demand. 12 are forecast to start in the April, and they have, so that will come through. And a number of the remainder, some of them will actually be cancelled. So yes, there are 28 projects as of the end of March that had not started, but there's some of the kind of the statistics behind them and things. So The other part that we're really proud of at the moment and really focused upon is looking at year one of the LTP delivery, so next year. So pleasingly, and I think we have mentioned it in the report, that we have put a plan together already. So looking at the circa 200 programs that are in the LTP year one, and really at a high level is run a series of workshops looking at who is actually going to deliver these programs, whether it's going to be the service line, the project management office, the depot, and really move through each of those programs. Looked at that and then breaking it down into the different projects, looking at the scope, looking at the risk, looking at the budgets. All that work is already happening now. We have a first, it's not a draft, we have a first plan in place, so we'll continue to focus on that. The analogy really with it, then we can move into looking at the initiation documents, the project plans, the bundling of procurement, all those sort of practical applications that we start the next financial year. The analogy being is a bit of a marathon analogy. I don't know if anyone's done much running, but if you start behind pace, it is very, very hard to catch up. So the objective is that we start that delivery of next financial year on pace, on point, and continue in that manner. So that were the three sort of hot topics, I guess, from a program view that's come through in this report, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing from Andrew. Thank you. I might open it up for questions, but I've got a couple myself. Can I just understand, you mentioned about the government's letter around the Better Off funding, so that's just a request, it's not a directive. Can I understand the status?
Yeah, so it is please think about this, and we'll touch base with you later this month and have confirmation by 30 June around that. So we're just doing some initial investigation work on what that would look like, and we'll bring that through the chamber for council decision. It needs to be a council decision, so it will come back through, and we're planning to bring that through the LTP process, because that'll be where we look at the funding of projects in the LTP, and which source of funding we use for that. So that's the intent there. So yeah, really just a very early heads up that we're taking a little bit further action, and we'll bring it back through later this month.
Just to further on that point, can I understand that, my understanding with that Better Off funding was quite specific projects, and I'd imagine many of those were committed in our long-term plan, so
Yeah,
how
so
does that compromise us?
we're doing that piece of work at the moment, but very initial indications is we would propose a switch of funding. So not cancel any projects, but just propose where they're being funded, and direct towards that way. But we've got a few questions, and in fact I think there's a meeting later this morning with Crown Infrastructure Partners about, is there set criteria like that? You're spot on, there was certain criteria last time. We're going to investigate what that will look like, if we need to have that same criteria, and feed that information through the deliberation process at the end of the month.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. Just to Councillor Dixon's question on the Better Off funding, the chart on page 75 outlines the allocation. So are you suggesting that it's just a reallocation of the same amount, or are they're not suggesting to bring any of the next tranche funding forward?
No, so the next tranche was cancelled some months ago. So yeah, it will just be a reallocation of the funding here.
Okay, thank you. And just to, Adam made a comment about the 28 programs that haven't been started, and I think you said that there was some budget move to other projects. I'm just wondering if there's programs that are not aren't going to proceed for. I think you said that there were about 8 that weren't needed. I'm just wanting some clarity around the budget. If there's a program that doesn't proceed, what happens to that budget?
Did I say programs? I was meaning projects. So yeah, so it's definitely not program budgets that have been cancelled or not happening. It's projects within programs.
Oh,
so
okay,
my
that
apologies
makes
if
more
I did say
sense.
programs. Yeah,
Yep.
so that's okay.
Yep, thank you,
Yeah.
that clarifies that, thank you. Just going to page 30, or perhaps page 27 for a start, just seeing the new capital progress, there's 12 million behind what we had budgeted for there. But then on page 30 in the debt chart, we're just about 2 million ahead. I'm just wondering if, I mean, the comment just says talks about timing of borrowings, but I'm just wondering if you can give some explanation as to why we're ahead in our borrowings if we're that far behind in terms of what we're expecting for Capital New.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it alludes to the council resolution as well. So there's obviously a significant fully funded two programs, near 10 million of that. So we're behind because of the fully funded programs, and we're fairly well on track with the council funded programs. Is the large reason, and we also and Steve may allude to this in the next paper. We've pre-funded the debt renewal based on the interest rates of the day and the advice we received from our Treasury advisors as well. So that's the timing comment in relation to debt.
Okay, so the big program that we're in recommendation to changing, was that not mostly with co-funded through Waka Kotahi?
It was 100% funded,
Yeah.
and so that's why there's a big variance in the spend, but not in the debt,
Okay,
because we weren't profiling that to be debt funded.
okay, thank you. That answers that. Just moving to page 66. The employee remuneration has been moved up for 1 million from the annual budget to the revised budget. Under expenses, the first one there, I'm just wondering why that increase from 59.9 to 60.9.
I may have to take that one back offline and just find the details of that. No.
Through you, Mr. Chair, whilst I don't have the complete detail in front of me, if I recall, in prior quarter, there was a request to increase and basically bring in-house basically a Toby replacement team as one part of that, which is capitalised against the capital program, but of course the way in which this is shown is the gross remuneration, so the offset actually occurs against, if I remember, against other expenses, so you'll see that the revised budget for other expenses decreases.
Okay, thank you. And just final question is page 68. There's a $28.2 million net increase in investments there. That wasn't part of the original budget. It's just in the actual part, and I'm just wondering what that relates to.
I'd have to go away and check that one, because so that's largely around our assets, and although it's not our debt, which is in the further one, so off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to answer that right here.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Tim. First question is just around the predicted operating deficit. Could you just give us a bit more detail about how you're intending to manage that? Because I understand that some of it is through the recommendation 2, but are there other impacts that we're aware of?
So we're completing, each budget holder is completing their forecast for year end. We're providing that information up to the executive leadership team. If there's any work that we can pause without impacting any service levels or any functions of council, we're attempting to do that, noting that obviously everyone has slightly different expectations of what services we provide and all that. We're also trying to reel in any non-warranted expenditure, that sort of stuff. So the messaging from the chief executive and the lead team has been, if you don't need to spend money in this last quarter, please don't, because it's tight. So we're working actively to try and manage those budgets whilst not reducing services. We'll use the transport example because we know it's a pressure this year. We're certainly not stopping anything in that space and trying to give as much budget available to ensure that we can meet and fix some of those issues that we have in that space.
So if I'll just jump in there, one of the other things that we're also looking at is in terms of our, we make some assessments around how successful we are in collecting certain revenues as well through the year, and whilst it's preliminary at the moment, it appears we may have been more successful than what perhaps our provisions are showing in one or two of our spaces, but we're just confirming that right at the moment, so that will reduce that forecast deficit from where it's sitting from better revenue collection than what we had actually anticipated.
Okay. So if we look at what's happening perhaps in a national level, where we hear that operations are being cancelled because Te Whatu Ora doesn't have enough money to run them, is that the kind of scenario we're looking at in council?
No.
Okay, good. Glad we've got that on the record. Okay, thank you. Just moving on to that delegation request in recommendation 3. Within waters, I'm fine about that, but a delegation of moving budget from the active and public transport budget to the roading budget, I have some concerns about that. What are the types of projects that you would be considering not spending on in the active and public transport area that we would then be spending on roading?
That's a great question. I might pass that one over to Glenn O'Connor, our Manager of Transport.
Mr Chair, Councillor, great question. Whilst we report our active transport and our roading components separately, they're essentially the same part of our transport network. Often our cycle lanes, if I picked on that example, are right beside our live lanes of our roads. Our focus has been in the roading is to get on top, control, limit the amount of potholes, for example, in our roading network. One of the key approaches is increasing the reseals program and getting a good waterproof layer over our main roads. Part of that reseals is quite a bit of pre-reseal, so making sure the surface of the road is up to standard. We've had quite a big reseals program, an enhanced reseals program this year to try and get it in front of those potholes. Often those potholes that exist in the roading network, as we're calling it, are right beside the cycle lanes in the active transport. So by removing or limiting the amount of new potholes, you're actually enhancing the level of service in the active transport, the cycleways, because you don't have the detritus, the material coming out of the potholes. You don't have drivers swerving to go around. So there's an engineering and asset management decision made on a case-by-case basis. Do we have the ability to reduce some of the short-term spending on our active transport, put that into the adjacent roading lanes and do reseals, which benefits both. That's one example. Another example of where we've been able to save money in the active transport is on bus stops, because we're in the fortunate position of putting new bus stops in, upgrading our assets. We haven't had to spend so much money on those older bus stops because we've got new ones. That's allowed us to redirect and increase our spending in the actual resealings.
Okay, thank you for the answer. It's not entirely it's not entirely reassuring. I understand that there are budgets that might not be being spent that could be reassigned. I guess, what assurance can you give us that there won't be money taken from budgets that could be spent on active transport to be spent on roads instead?
The assurance, councillor, is around the level of service is still being provided on the active transport, that our pavements on active transport, that our crossings, that our bus shelters are still up to standard, and that we get more value for both parts of the reporting activities by reallocating that in this circumstance. Certainly it's not something that you'd want to do, or we would encourage council to do in the long term, but as a short-term measure, once those judgments are made, we can provide an adequate level of service across both activities.
Okay, I'll save any more for comment. So moving on then to the animal shelter, which has been in the 99% finished category for quite some time now. Can you give us an update there?
We might pass that one over to Bryce.
Kia ora, councillors. Bryce Hosking, Group Manager of Property and Resource Recovery. Yes, the animal shelter is sitting at about 99.5% complete now. We're just waiting on a couple of the gates that are essentially having to be they're made special for the facility, and so we're just waiting on the last of those to arrive. I went through the facility Friday last week. It is pretty much finished, really. It's just those little last few finishing items before we can officially declare it open, and we'll be looking to have an opening towards the end of May.
Okay, thank you. And then just a question around the planning that's underway for year one of the long-term plan, Adam. Can you just give us a bit more insight into that process, given that we haven't yet confirmed what's in year one?
Yeah, one would never want to assume, of course.
Through you,
sorry, Chris.
Mr. Chair, I might actually just take that. So, look, we've talked a lot about deliverability over the last wee while, and our need to significantly up our capability in this area. So I think Adam gave you some insights earlier into the sort of things that we're doing, because ultimately we need to get into a sort of a smooth program which doesn't have the sort of the peaks and troughs, and to just sort of keep ahead of that. So it's a tricky year because we are, coming into a new LTP year. We don't have certainty about exactly which programs or which projects will be funded, but we can't just sit here and do nothing and wait until we've got that certainty. So we have to take a bit of risk. We have to say, well, look, let's assume at the moment that what's in the draft LTP is what we're planning for. We know that we were going to have to reassess that later and say, okay, well, we're going to adjust that. But if we don't start that process now and make some assumptions and get some stuff under the way, we will never deliver next year's program. So there's a few other things we're doing. So for instance, we will actually plan for probably about 110% of our projects to be done next year, because we know, with certainty that some things are going to go wrong. So the only way to get 100% is to be able to do that, have that little bit of flexibility where we come to you and say, look, this one's gone off the rails. We'll pause that for now or push it into next year, but we want to bring this one forward, so we're sort of managing to that. And these are the sort of things that we have to do. That it means we have to take some risks, and sometimes there will be some plans that we get done that never get out of the bottom drawer. But if we don't do that, we won't have things effectively that shovel ready so that we can get that done. I am absolutely 100% determined that next year we will deliver 100% of the program. But the only way we're going to do that is to do things differently, and this is one of the things that we need to do.
So, is it all just planning, or is there any pre-purchase of materials or pre-ordering of gear or whatever?
We're planning, yeah. So it's about planning and getting organised, assessing our resources, getting things lined up.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harpiter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Johnson pretty much stole most of my question, which was around asking, so I'm going to withdraw. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few questions from me. Starting on page 19 on the non-rates revenue, I see that we've got sales of 7.3 million. I assume that's a few Tamakuku sales, but was wondering what makes up the rest of that, given it's our most significant non-rates revenue source.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the bottom bullet point on the right-hand side of the page notes that it includes parking meter revenue of 1.9 million, rubbish bags of 1.4, after-hours contact centre of 1.5, and that is 4.8 of that 7.3 million there.
Appreciate that. Apologies, I must have not read that last bullet point. On page 33, or under the quarterly performance measures, I see, as usual, resource consent applications are still not going to be completed in their statutory timeframes. I'm just wondering, it says that 74% were processed within statutory timeframes. How many of those were granted without extensions?
Kia ora koutou, Kerry Lee, Probate Acting Chief Customer Officer. Sorry, Councillor, can I ask you to repeat that?
Of course. So the 74% of resource consent applications that were processed within statutory timeframes, how many of those were processed without extensions?
I'll need to come back to you before the end of today with details.
And do you know what the average time it takes to get, or for a resource consent to be processed with the council, in terms of working days?
I can tell you what the statutory timeframes are, which is what they alluded to in the report, which is 20 days, can be extended for a further 20 days. But again, I can come back to you with the average.
That'd be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zebulon.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks. I'm also on the performance measures on page 37, the transport measures number 4 about the footpaths. Excuse me. And just noting it says 93% of the footpath network is rated either excellent to average. Do we have a breakdown of what percentage of that is average? What is excellent? What's the division between those?
I'm getting nods from over there, so going to say yes. Bryce we'll come back to you with that percentage breakdown.
That'd be great. That's all from me. Thank you.
Happy with that? Okay, thank you. Just following through, one of the responses were that we were satisfied that the levels of service or the activity budget around active and public transport were fine and had more need in roading. I understood that our needs around some of the footpath and curb and channel and some of that stuff, is that included in this active transport and public transport budget? Our asset management plan is not indicating that we needed more investment in that space that we were behind on our delivery on that renewal?
Active transport has footpaths in as well as our main roading activity, and so there are some crossovers for our users of a network that it's hard to tell the difference, but the shared paths, for example, the footpaths on that, the crossings are in active transport. Are in active transport. The other footpaths are in our roading activity.
Okay, so can I just reconfirm your response earlier was that in the active and public transport, you're comfortable that our level of service doesn't have need for the budgets?
We're comfortable that the higher need was in the roading activity and that there was no immediate safety issues that we weren't resolving in the active transport by moving budgets around.
Thank you. No further. There is one further question, Councillor Barrett. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies for coming in late. Just did want to clarify around recommendation 2 that sits here around the $4 million cut to the Urban Cycle Network budget. So just for my clarity, is that related to the balance between Botanical and Rohini, not to the Aroha North segment?
Someone will correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's directly related to the program that Waka Kotahi are no longer funding. So it's just pulling out whatever is unspent, given it was 100% funded.
Thanks. I think that then would confirm my second question was that it's not actually a savings to council or ratepayers as such.
Correct, yep, that's just what it is actually doing in the purest sense is removing 4 million of that variance from the capital revenue and the capital spend, given we're not going to spend it because we don't have the funding any further.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chair.
Oh, yeah. Happy with that? Thank you, officers. There's no further question. I'm prepared to move the recommendations for us with a slight inclusion in 3, which is the Chief Executive be given delegation for the 23-24 financial year. So we close off on the delegation just for this current budget. But otherwise, I'll read through as been requested. That 1, that the committee received the memorandum titled Quarterly Performance and Financial Report, period ending 31st of March 24, and related attachments presented at the 8th of May 24 meeting. 2, that the capital revenue and expenditure budgets for for the program 22-07 urban cycle infrastructure network improvements, transport choices be reduced or reduced by 4,092,000. To 751,000. And 3, the wording would be that the Chief Executive is given delegation for the 23/24 financial year to move budgets in excess of the existing delegation between roading and active and public transport and between stormwater, water and wastewater, and that these budget movements will be reported to the June 24 quarterly report. I'll move those, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for comment and debate. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just some general comments to start with. Actually really heartened with the uplift in capital spend, which has been really good to see. And I think, we've got more confidence in our ability to complete the capital projects now, which is, again, pleasing. A little bit concerned about the predicted operating deficit, more so in that I don't want to see impact on level of service. So whilst I understand the need to, look at the budgets carefully in the last quarter, I don't want to be in this situation like we've had with the road sweeping or any other thing, where councillors' phones are ringing hot with residents complaining that whatever it might be isn't being done. So I think there's definitely a balance to be struck there between saving money so that the bottom line looks better at the end of the year and continuing to provide services to our residents which are important to them and us. So I'll just sound that note of caution there. In terms of the resolution 3 around the delegation to move budgets, I do have some concerns about accepting that we're going to be moving money from active and public transport into roading. And although, we were told that the level of service would not be affected in active transport, unless we're talking about projects that are not going ahead for some reason, I just can't see how robbing Peter to pay Paul is going to work in this instance. We're going to end up with a lower result in active and public transport. And given that we've, spent a lot of time trying to establish the size of these budgets and the programs and projects that we want done, at this stage to be sort of offering up active and public transport as a sacrificial lamb, I'm not really very comfortable with. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be voting in favour of that one. I mean, I understand we've got to be pragmatic and money's needed for roading, but I just think it's a little bit tempting to be taking money out of active and public transport when our strategic direction and goals are to increase active and public transport, and we're never going to be able to do that if we're continually pinching those budgets to fill in holes in the road. So that would be my concern there. I think that's all I need to say. Thank you.
Can I just clarify, Councillor Johnson, were you wanting to separate 3? Okay, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Once again, really good quality information in this report, so thanks to the officers for that. I'm fairly comfortable with the way things are trending this year. My only real comment is in the information that we've been given around the preparation for Year 1 capital program. And I think it's really important for us to confirm that the programs in the LTP are draft until they're confirmed in June. And I know that does create some challenges for officers, but we have been in the position in the past where there's been so much of that program that has been determined to have already been started that it limits our choices. And we certainly need to have the ability to respond to our community in terms of the submissions that come through. So from my perspective, I think it's better to take the risk of a lesser delivery of the Year 1 capital program than take the risks that might be occurred through planning for starting programs that may or may not proceed once we come to make those decisions. So, yeah, that's my only real comment based on the information that's been provided today.
Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to support all three recommendations. I think that's been a very pragmatic approach, and I think from a point of view of trying to move money to make things work for the council, I think it's a very good way forward, and I thank officers for bringing it forward to us. In terms of what Councillor Naylor has just said, I fully endorse what she has just said, and I was struggling with what the officers were saying, and I understand where Adam was coming from in terms of his analogy about the marathon. But it is the 1st of June that we are looking at, and talking about projects that are ahead of us and we haven't decided on those projects yet is very hard. So we've got to make that decision through a long-term planning process, and some of those projects haven't been decided on yet. Understand that you are in a planning phase as officers, but we are still in a deciding phase as councillors. So we've got to get through that process first before we can decide on which projects are going to go forward. So I understand exactly where Councillor Naylor is coming from, and that's where Councillor Johnson was going with her question. So totally understand that process, but support where Councillor Naylor was coming from. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Councillor Zebulon.
Mr. Chair, I do have a direct view from that regard forward planning. I think the nature of the planning that was outlined in terms of which teams might have capacity, who might take lead on what things, what resources might be required, so that we're ready to go on whatever we do go on. Once the long-term plan is confirmed and once they're decided, I think is very wise, and brings to mind the quote that time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. I think that's a good use of our time. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just have some closing comments too around the financial result at this point being quite close to what we had planned for, and the efforts that have been shown to bring that to even a more favourable result in the next quarter for the close off of the financial year, I think is pleasing to see the efforts of the officers. I would have a similar view to Councillor Zebulon that the planning, I think we do need to plan to execute a pretty fair work schedule and do the pre-work. I think it's disappointing that the confirmation through the central government mechanism is unable to keep up with the need of local authority to kind of lock some of those other contributions in, and that we have to plan for over and above what we intended, just in case of that wider scope. So those are my 2 points in closing, but otherwise there's no other members wanting to speak. I'll now invite a vote. And this is on 1 and 2, and we'll separate 3 for a follow-up vote. Thank you. That's passed unanimously, 15 votes for. Now invite a vote on recommendation 3. passed, 13 votes for and 2 against. That closes off item 7, moves us to item 8 and invites Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager for Finance, to present the Treasury Report quarterly ending 31st of March 24. Floor is yours, Steve. Welcome.
Good morning, councillors. I think there's nothing really significant that's occurred during the last quarter in relation to this debt profile of the council. So I think I'll just take it as read and invite questions.
Okay. Open up for questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Steve. Just a couple of questions from me on page 81, under 3.15. The first bullet point there talks about the decisions on the proposed capital expenditure program and government decisions on the future structure of the provision of Three Waters. Are we still waiting for further information on that? I thought the information was that we pay, that comes under us now. Is there still some uncertainty around that?
I think perhaps in terms of the way in which I've got the report worded, it leads you to believe that I'm still considering that. What we were doing up until a while back was taking that into account and measuring both with water in and with water out, just to make sure we're going. But you'll see in the last bullet point, we've been saying that actually now we're using the forecast, the draft forecast from the 10-year plan as the basis for considering the risk assessments that we're making for interest rate risk. So the Three Waters, effectively right now, we're not taking that into consideration in terms of the...
Okay, thank you. And just a second bullet point down there talks about the 30%, and we've often understood that, annual budgets, but reduce them by 30%. And I think traditionally that was based on an assumption that we would not deliver the full capital program in any given year.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, given the information that we got in the previous report around planning for 110 so that 100% can be delivered, whether that 30% haircut is still relevant in light of the current delivery of our capital program?
Yes, again, in terms of an answer, it's similar to the one I've just given you in relation to the bullet point above that. Really what we had been doing was taking the view, the two lots, water in, water out, and then reducing the program with the haircut. Now, for the purpose of this report, we've just taken the projection for the 10-year plan and used that as the basis for doing the assessments right now.
Okay, so thank you for that. So just looking at the graph on page 87, obviously that red line is that top line is the current LTP.
Yes.
What's the relevance of these other grey lines underneath there with the, I presumed with the 30% haircut?
Yes, they apply the policy and say what you would need to have fixed in order to live within the policy at the upper and lower levels throughout that time frame. So the shaded bit that you see underneath it, you'll see falls within that upper and lower grey line throughout that time, and that's what the objective is in terms of the way in which the debt's managed. Because
are you able to...
you'll see that we need to have a forecast that we're working to over the 10 years, and then in each of those years, the policy prescribes what proportion in terms of maturities over that time is fixed and what proportion is floating. And so that translates to that line, that it's somewhere between the upper and lower limits in those grey lines. And so that shaded bit, as I said, shows that we're living within that limit.
So is the current policy still appropriate and relevant to what our current forecast looks like?
Yes, the policy is appropriate still in terms of the upper and lower limit because they're expressed in percentage terms.
So it's just a matter of which debt level we're applying those percentages to, and if you translate the percentages, you get the grey lines, using the top line as our forecast for the moment. But once the council approves the long-term plan, obviously we'll be a bit more certainty again, and we'll revise for the next period just quite what we use as the basis of the forecast.
So, sorry to continue this, but if I don't understand it, I'm sure there might be others around the room that also. So, the 30% reduction, are you able to explain the current relevance of that?
For the purposes of this graph, we're not using that now at all. What I've done is just taken the forecast debt level from the plan and applied the percentages to that without any haircuts.
Which percentages?
The percentages of how much you'll have fixed and floating.
Maybe if I just jump in for a moment. So if you're looking at that graph specifically, the red line is the forecast debt position of the draft long-term plan. The top grey line is the maximum amount of, fixed borrowing as per the policy, because it's percentages over years each year. And the bottom grey line is the minimum amount of fixing that we have to have against our debt in relevance to that draft long-term plan debt projection.
Okay, thank you. So just for final question, so the gap between the top grey line and the top red line, is that the assumption that that debt would be on a variable rate?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. There's no further questions. Thank you for presenting your report. I'm happy to move the recommendations before us that are mirroring the order paper, that the committee note the performance of the council treasury activity for the quarter ending 31st of March 2024, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open up for any comment or debate. There being none, I'd now like to invite. That has passed unanimously, 15 votes for. Moves us to item 9, and now I'd like to welcome Hannah White, Democracy and Governance Manager, and Scott Manser, the Finance Manager, to present the Delegations Manual, Financial Delegation Section Update. Welcome.
Morning again. Do you mind if I quickly jump back to a question from the earlier paper around the term investments? So I've just been checking in with the team, and that net increase in investments was term deposits. So where we had borrowed the money, we'd invested it. Most of those matured back in April, so just at that 31 March date, they were out in a term deposit. So that's the increase in investments that we had there.
Great, thanks, Scott.
Right, jumping to the current paper now. So we'll take this largely as read. There's a lot there, and obviously this is, I think, part 3 of the process and the finalisation of that. Couple of talking points from my point of view before I pass to Hannah. The current Chief Executive delegation is 50% of the spend sum, or 800,000. We're proposing to change that to 3 million over 3 years, or largely $1 million a year for that. We've also removed the term transaction and changed that to commitment. So rather than one individual transaction, it's talking about the whole of a contract value as well, in line with our updated procurement guidelines and policy. We've simplified the delegations policy and made it a lot easier to read, which is very helpful from an officer point of view of understanding what's intended there. And we've also added in some additional reporting obligations, very much what we're actually doing in the quarter report already, but just putting that in the policy as well. And with those reporting obligations, we're not expecting a large increase of the number of papers coming to the chamber for approval. That's expected to be about the same. Hannah, anything that you want to? Excellent. Open up for questions, I guess.
Great, thank you. The floor is open for questions. Councillor Hapeta.
Thank you. What's the impact of this?
makes my life a lot easier, if I'm completely honest. It really is a simplification. We have slightly increased the chief executive's delegation. That number hasn't been reviewed in a number of years. So we're actually still under, even if we inflated that number up, we're still proposing a lower than inflation applied delegation.
So is any financial risk?
None that I'm aware of, and the way we have written the reporting obligations is anything over 100,000 will be reported back through the quarter report, and you'll see either more movements from the chief executive under delegation and or more resolutions like the one just a little bit earlier in advance of those things.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just earlier today, there was clarity around the changing a project versus changing a program, and that kind of makes quite a difference. Do you think that's clear in this policy? I'm looking at the definitions, and certainly program is in the definitions, but project isn't.
Yeah, so project is definitely an internal clustering of projects within a wider program. Obviously, as council, you can set the different programs. A lot of it is ease of administration. Like there'll be several projects within. If we take a shared pathway, for example, there'll be a series of different projects in there that each have their own planning and delivery process, versus having one big project that could get held up for a number of years based on one little part down the end. So it's really ensuring that we're managing to the program and that you've set, but also giving officers enough ability to advance certain parts of works under different work streams to enable some of those efficiencies that was also talked about a little bit earlier.
Yep, I totally agree with you. Do you think this policy is clear enough on that?
Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one point of clarification from me. When you mentioned about the differentiation from commitments versus transactions, I thought that was tidied up prior to now from past lessons learned.
Not in a policy. I think in actuals we had been operating that way. This is purely updating that policy to reflect that, and certainly the advice from the Business Assurance Division is we need to look at the whole of life cost to council and things like that. So we'd certainly been beginning that way. We're just formalising now through the process.
Okay, great. Thank you for presenting this item. There's no further questions. I am happy to move on the chair the three recommendations that the council adopt the revision of the financial section and definition section of the delegations manual attached 1 and 2 effective from 1st July 2024. 2, the council revoke previous sections 1.19-1.2 and 5.3-5.15 of the delegations manual effective of 1st July 2024. And 3, that council note the fees and charges clauses of the financial delegations will be reviewed with the financial and financing policy and a report brought back to council. Seconded by Councillor Naylor. I would lead off and speak to that. Just further clarity, I think moving away from the 50% of the specified sum makes sense to have a fixed sum. Gives clarity across those 3 periods as described, and I think it's essential that we have commitment in our terminology, not transactions, because of past learnings. I'm surprised we hadn't picked that up in this document prior till now. And so overall, I think this gives a lot of clarity and an ability to measure. And there is still, as we've had with the previous item, a request for having extensions to that delegation that's in place, but that will always come before a committee, at least, if not council. Those are my comments. There's no others wishing to speak. Therefore, I'll invite a vote. Thank you. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. That moves us to item 10, which is the draft Palmerston North Animal and Bees Bylaw 2024 deliberations, and invite Stacey Solomon, our policy analyst, to present this item. Welcome.
Atamaria Koto, happy to bring you this report for your deliberations on the Palmerston North Animals and Bees bylaw. This report is the third you have received as part of this review process, and it includes advice for you to consider as you make your decision whether or not to approve it for adoption and commencement. We've prepared and consulted with the community on the draft bylaw in January and February of this year. The proposal included changes to the bylaw intended to update references, improve interpretation, to better explain how the bylaw is applied, and to continue to align our own practice with generally accepted good practice in New Zealand. The purpose of this bylaw is to protect the public from nuisance, health and safety concerns, or other injury which may be caused by the keeping of privately owned animals or bees. Like all of our bylaws, this bylaw is generally very permissive in its approach, and it remains as such. This approach appears to suit our community quite well. We received 32 submissions with mixed responses to different parts of our proposal, though the majority of respondents were generally quite supportive. Some submissions which did not support our proposal were also received, and those submissions had very clearly articulated concerns which we've provided analysis and advice to you as part of this report for, along with further changes to the bylaw following consultation based on that feedback. If recommended for adoption today, we've set a commencement date of 1 September. The new bylaw controls will come into effect at that time. Happy to answer any queries you have. We have officers from Environmental Protection Services here today as well to assist with those answers.
Stacey, Councillor Johnson has questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Stacey. I appreciate that you've tried to align the bylaw with the codes of welfare, understanding that, as you stated, the bylaw is primarily to prevent nuisance rather than to ensure welfare. But I appreciate that you have included those references. But given that, if there were changes to the codes of welfare, would that result in us needing to review this bylaw sooner?
It would really depend. If there was a change to the code of welfare, generally speaking, we would have good advance notice of that. It is a process to change the code of welfare through MPI and through their own panels that do that. We could bring forward a review if it were necessary. If it were not necessary, we could leave the bylaw and make that update at its next scheduled review point for this particular bylaw, because we are now on a 10-year review. If it is adopted by council, we would look to make that change in 2034 if the review wasn't brought forward. We would always, though, intend to apply best practice where we could. So if there was a significant change to a code of welfare, we could approach our community about that and see their thoughts on it.
Okay. Is there another option here where we reference the current code of welfare in our bylaw but don't extract parts from it?
Yes.
Has that been considered?
That is certainly an approach we can take and we have considered. One of the things we are trying to do with our bylaw is to contain within it to perhaps make it more effective, to make it a little bit more instructional, just to provide the very basic things that we would like to see people doing to achieve compliance. It is possible not to include that information in the bylaw, and for it to have the same effect, there is perhaps just a little bit, an additional step somewhere in there for us as officers to communicate that more actively to the community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so given that you've considered the two options, you've come down on the side of including some instructions in the bylaw.
Yes.
Would it be fair to say the downside of that is that if the code changes significantly, we'd need to review the bylaw sooner, but the advantage of it is it spells out in one place to people what's expected rather than having to go look at another document?
Yes, so the effectiveness of our our regulatory approach really does rely on a lot of voluntary compliance. And to get a high level of voluntary compliance, we're looking to provide the minimum amount of information. So yes, you are right. There is that trade-off. And in this instance, we've gone with providing a little bit more instruction and looking to see that result in a reduction of potential for nuisance, accepting that there are processes which are outside of the control of this council in those codes of welfare where they may change in advance of our next review.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to ask some questions on beekeeping related to page 161 of the report. Given the reports acknowledge that bees will operate within around a 5-kilometre radius of their hive, I just want to understand the rationale for having a distinction between only being allowed 2 hives on a 500 to 700 metre property versus 4 on a 700 to 1,000 metre property. In material terms, what is the difference, given the bees will roam well outside the bounds of that specific property line anyway?
Sure, I think I understand your question. Rather than having like a very high concentration of hives in one area, spreading them out across a larger number of slightly larger properties ensures that those bees continue to have access to food sources primarily. It also will reduce the potential for nuisance and noise. So that is one of those, primarily the reason for that scale of property size by hive number.
Right, thank you. And in terms of clause C, I see we've changed it from hives being positioned to be encouraged in a direction away from a neighbouring property to directed away from a neighbouring property. Are we anticipating that'll impact any existing hives, or is that more a future provision for new hives being put in?
Ideally, it is already being done now. So the Beekeepers Association provides a very significant amount of material and educational resources to beekeepers that provide this advice in how to do these things in a much more specific way. So we've put it in here based on the feedback we received where people who are experiencing some nuisance issues from bees are not convinced that the wording we had provided would correct the nuisance issues they were experiencing. So they've requested that it be perhaps a little bit more directive, so we've changed that, and then we've confirmed that with the practice of beekeepers that it is suitable for that to occur. Does that help?
That's great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zebulon.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Stacey. I'm looking at page 143 about clause 13, which is also about beekeeping, and the submitter raised the issue about recourse for nuisance, essentially, and we've just noted that there's general provisions in the bylaw which can enable council to respond to nuisance and to take appropriate action, and I'm just wondering, do we have a scale of what's defined as appropriate action, or as the submitter suggests, does it go sort of straight to removal?
Sure, so I might ask Rebecca from Environmental Protection Services to come down and respond to the specifics of that, but our general provisions in the bylaw do give council the ability to respond to nuisance issues. So if there were nuisance issues occurring from bees, we would respond in that way. I think Rebecca probably will have a more succinct answer to that query though.
Thank you.
Right hand side is a button there. Great stuff. Welcome.
Kia ora koutou, Rebecca Adamson, Acting Environmental Protection Services Manager, through the Chair. In response to the question, it would be entirely dependent on the scenario for the complaint, so the officer would attend and provide advice based on what they're seeing for that scenario, so it would be quite difficult to describe the full action taken without the full problem being identified.
Sure, so it's case by case.
Yep.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. And I just had one more about in relation to cats, because there was numerous submitters raised various issues, and they've sort of been out of scope of the bylaw, or would be such a change that it would require us to significantly change and then reconsult. And so I think we have largely said this is referred to staff as more of an operational, educative measure. Is that sufficient, I guess, in your opinion, that we could address some of these issues through educative means to get that voluntary compliance that we're looking for?
I believe it is sufficient. Our first point of recourse, I guess, is always to engage and educate, but prior to enforcement to achieve that high level of voluntary compliance, yes.
Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Stacey, for leading this item. There's no further questions. I'll move the recommendations that pertain to this item 10. I'll just bring them forward. Which are that Council confirm A, the Palmerston North Animal and Bee Bylaw 2024 is the most appropriate means of addressing the perceived problem of regulating the specific requirements of the keeping of animals other than dogs and bees in Palmerston North, protecting the health and safety of the community. And B, the form of the bylaw is the most appropriate form of bylaw. And C, the bylaw does not give rise to any implications under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990. 2, that Council adopt the Palmerston North Animal and Bees Bylaw 2024 and the Palmerston North Animals and Bees Bylaw Administration Manual 2024 as attached in 2 and 3. Seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comment or debate. There being none, I'd now like to invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. Brings us to item 11, which is tongue-tied. Draft Palmerston North Dog Control Policy 2024 deliberations, and invite Kate Harridge, Policy Analyst, and Stacey Solomon, Policy Analyst, to the table to present this item. Welcome.
Kia ora koutou. We are pleased to bring you this paper for your deliberations on the dog control policy. This paper follows a process of community consultation and the hearing of submitters by this committee. We have made amendments to the policy, mainly to ensure all references to appropriate legislation, including the current Code of Welfare for Dogs, is correct. These minor changes do not alter the intention of the policy. As mentioned in this paper, once adopted, the dog control policy will be given effect by a replacement dog control bylaw. This needs to be done within 60 days of the policy being adopted. The subsequent bylaw will be drafted for adoption by Council at its meeting in June. Council does not need to consult on its bylaw if it already consulted on its policy under Section 10 of the Dog Control Act. We are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions from me relating to two ideas that came up through submissions that you've acknowledged will need further work or further consultation to consider. So the first one is around the requests from a number of people in the community for a dog on leash area for the front part of Linklater Park. So you've said officers will do more work on this. Can you describe how that will happen and whether there's any time frame in consideration with that, or if you need further direction from Council to ensure that that happens in a timely way?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Linklater did come up as an issue in our consultation process. We have provided the advice that we do not believe that as part of this process, it is a good time for us to make that requested change to Linklater. I think we all acknowledge that Linklater is a significant asset to our community, both in Kelvin Grove and more broadly than that. So to make that change, to make the front part of Linklater Reserve on leash, would be a significant change to the level of service we currently provide out there. We would be hesitant to make that change now because we didn't consult on it. it's one question to say, do you like taking your dog to Linklater? It's another thing to say we are proposing to make half of Linklater on leash. So what we would be planning to do was, if the council were minded for us to look into making a change at Linklater to perhaps provide us that direction, we could then go to the community, gather information from them, and to get a better understanding about what exactly the issues are being experienced at Linklater, bring that information to you and provide advice at that time.
Okay, thank you, Stacey. I'll just signal, Chair, I'm happy to put such a recommendation forward, and Councillor Wood will he hasn't seen what I've written yet, but he'll second it. Second question is around the request that we had, and the answer may well be the same, the request that was made around consideration of, I suppose you could describe it as a rehabilitation clause for dogs that were designated menacing. And again, I think your comments, which I understand, were that, it was something that would need to be considered further. How would you suggest that we might proceed with investigating that as an option?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think for us as the implementing officers, the Dog Control Act provides us with quite detailed guidance on how to apply the menacing classification to a dog. It's either by breed or by action of the dog that they receive that classification. The same Act does not provide us guidance about how to remove the classification, whether or not a rehabilitation program has been attempted successfully or unsuccessfully with a dog. Primarily for us, I think, if we were to further look into that, we would be wanting to understand exactly what the council's appetite around risk was for that. If a menacing dog was to have that classification removed, there are implications, I believe, for the council and for the community. So we would want to know exactly what those are, exactly what the responsibilities of the council are, and at that point, exactly what the feeling of the community was on such a matter.
So is that something that you think would need a report, a staff report, and then a potential consultation? Or I'm just looking to have some guidance on how you think that could be, what the process might be to go down that route. Would it be to get a report back first of all?
I think there would probably be perhaps even some, prior to a report, perhaps the work that would need to be done to get there would be to workshop that with the council, I think, just to get that kind of baseline about exactly what direction we would like to see that going, so that we could then provide that advice in the form of a report if that is what was desired by the council.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. I'm just writing out that recommendation.
That's fine. I'll come back to you once we complete questions. Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Stacey and Kate. I've just already got one line of questioning. It's really around paragraph 4.9, page 178, which is the preferred owner status, and the requirement to have an emergency contingency. Can you please give me some indication in terms of, or some examples of where that might work, and perhaps how we would actually sort of regulate any consistency around decision making for that, please?
Through the chair, apologies, Councillor, I don't think I quite understand your question.
To be a preferred owner, there is a new part in, or new provisions in there around ensuring that you've actually got an emergency contingency to, feed water, the dog, etc. So, what I'm concerned about, or want some sort of clarification around, is the attainability of that preferred owner status. And if you could perhaps just give us some examples of what would be required for an owner to actually meet that particular new requirement.
Sure. I might ask Ross to come down add perhaps to the initial answer I will provide. What we are looking for is that in the event of an emergency, and that is either a personal emergency, perhaps there has been a passing in the family, or a medical emergency, or indeed a civic emergency perhaps, that we are able to see from a preferred owner that they have plans in place for their dog if they are unable to meet the needs of their dogs on one of those occasions. So that might be that they, for example, are aware of local boarding kennels that they can send their dog to, and that their dog perhaps is known to that boarding kennel so that they can go there if they need to leave the town and they cannot take their dog with them. It may also be that in the event of a civil emergency that they have food available for their dog and they are aware of perhaps places they can go to continue to meet the welfare needs of that dog in terms of its exercising, or their the welfare stations that they may need to evacuate to, that they can take their dog there. Ross might be able to answer that more clearly.
Good morning, everyone. Ross McDermott, Team Leader, Animal Management. Yeah, I think Stacey's covered off most of the intention behind that change there. We do partner a lot with Civil Defence and looking at emergency readiness. So like they're encouraging residents of the city to have like a grab and go type bag with or access to food and water for a duration. That's the sort of thing we're looking for their dogs. Have they got a small bag of dog food and a couple bottles of water they can take with them? Bedding, anything like that. So just something that the owner can show us that they have actually considered their animal and what they're going to do should something go wrong.
Okay, thank you. So at this point in time, we don't, I'm taking from the answers that I've been given is that at this time we haven't really defined exactly what it is that is needed to meet that requirement. Do we have to do some more work in this area to give owners a clearer understanding of what is needed?
I think as part of the application process for the preferred owner, we can provide that information to them there. They will have a number of other requirements through that application that they will be able to see, that they'll be able to understand, and that we can help them to understand the ways they can meet it. That information is probably better placed in that part of the process for our preferred owners.
Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zeppelin.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Other question?
On page 193, there was a submission, it's under other changes, talking about the adequacy of our policy, and that some commenters had called for clearer and more comprehensive wording to address concerns about loopholes that allow for irresponsible behaviour towards dogs and animals. And just the comment there doesn't, to me, quite match up with the calls for clearer wording. So I just wanted to get a comment from you about whether or not you feel that we have made the wording clearer and more comprehensive to close off some of those loopholes.
Sorry, Councillor, are you able to point to the part on page 193 that you referred to?
Yes, it's the just check. It's the second from the bottom. It's under adequacy of policy, submission number 68.
Sure. In terms of the adequacy of our policy, I believe we do have a very good policy. It previously went through a significant overhaul in the last review to make it align with the requirements of the Dog Control Act. We are continuing to align it as such. There will always be an exception in a policy in terms of how people will individually interpret it. So we are always in the spirit of continuous improvement, attempting to make it easier for people to achieve compliance, and we have done that here. If this person was particularly concerned that they themselves didn't understand the requirements, we are of course always able to facilitate perhaps education to achieve that compliance. It wouldn't be one individual that would apply to. There's perhaps a number of people where we can front foot that as well.
Thank you. And just the one above it is concerned about dog waste in public areas and potential health hazards, and it's been noted that that's out of scope. So I was curious if the policy is sort of about managing nuisance, do we define dog waste as nuisance, or how come that particular aspect is defined as out of scope?
I think the part here that is out of scope is the second part of that comment, where it's commenters call for a better control of dog waste, increased fines for offenders, and stricter enforcement of regulations. In terms of the fines, we don't set those.
Yeah.
We administer them where we are able to through the Act as warranted officers. And stricter enforcement of regulations, I think this is another one of the points where unless you are there observing the behaviour and are able to intervene at that time to prevent the action or to provide a remedy to the action, it can be hard to enforce.
Yes, not practical.
Not practical in that in the immediate sense for it.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I'm just looking at page 190 at the prohibited public spaces, and that first item, the need for clarity and communication around dog on leash and dog off leash areas. It just has in the officer comment staff response, it's got that there's a list available on the council website and also lists in the policy. In terms of actual signage, the recommendation just said noted no changes. Is the staff view that our signage is sufficient currently for people to understand whether areas are off leash or on leash?
I think we do have a very good amount of signage to communicate the controls in particular areas to people. Again, that is something that we are always improving on. I think we have recently developed additional signage for Linklater that provides those helpful instructions to the community that do signal that this is an off-leash area, this is an on-leash area, acknowledging that if you happen to not see that particular sign, perhaps your dog will be off-leash when it should be on-leash. But repeated use of those spaces, I think, would help people to achieve that more easily.
Repeated what, sorry?
Repeated use of the areas, so perhaps if you missed seeing that particular sign on your first trip there, maybe you would see it again on the second time and you would be able to achieve compliance.
And what's our mechanism for enforcement and compliance of that?
I might pass that one to Ross.
So for our dogs on leash areas, the animal management team try to patrol those spaces as much as possible, and if there's any complaints from members of the public, we attend to those to try and educate the owner. Where there's repeat offending from the same person, we would work through education, compliance and enforcement.
Okay, thank you. And just moving to page 194, in the comment around enforcement and penalties for irresponsible owners, it's the recommendation there, it says out of scope but noted no changes. Comment has been referred to officers for their consideration. I'm just wondering if officers are going to consider this. At what point will there be any feedback loop to us in terms of reporting about whatever's considered in this area?
I think our primary point of reporting in our dog control activity to the council and to this committee is through that Section 10A dog control report that comes through yearly to you. If we needed to include something to articulate exactly what has occurred in the last year in terms of the policy and what was reviewed, we can do so. We always do make mention of the dog control policy in that Section 10A report, so we can provide that information at that time if that would be helpful.
So in terms, okay, so the call under these 5 submissions for strict enforcement and penalties for irresponsible dog owners, will that be considered on that next yearly report? Is that what you're saying?
I think what we're saying is that we will be able to detail for you the actions we've taken in response to the things that these submitters have called for and how we are responding, perhaps not just to these issues, but more generally as part of our dog control activity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to ask some follow-up questions regarding Linklater Reserve. So I see on page 213 under 20, our Linklater Reserve is classed as a dog exercise area. Without determining what the results of a further engagement with the community would be, if there was a view that we wanted to further restrict the exercise area at Linklater Park, what would the process be in terms of this bylaw without having to reconsult on the entire bylaw? Could we consult on simply changing 20L?
Through the chair, yes, that would be the approach. We would just isolate Linklater as the single issue we would be consulting with our community on. That feedback would then result in an amendment to our policy, which would feed through into our bylaw.
And process-wise, that would result in us going through this process again, just on a much smaller scale. So you'd have a hearing, a summary of submissions, and then a decision.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that clarification.
Thank you. Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's lots of unregistered dogs in the city. Is council doing anything with veterinary practices to help them educate their clients about the joys of registering their dogs?
Yeah, through the chair. So every year we follow up on dog registrations. You're probably aware we send out an account to dog owners start June and give them through till the 1st of August to get their dog registered before there's any penalties added. But later in the year we try and either phone or visit dog owners to encourage registration and the importance of that. And then throughout complaints that we receive through the year, that's part and parcel with those as well.
What about dealing with veterinary practices? Do you actively consult with them to try and get them to get their clients to register their animals when they're bringing them in clearly unregistered?
Not actively. Yeah, in the past we've had conversations with vet clinics, and there's slight concern around maintaining customers if they're seen to be referring people on to us, especially when they can't afford to be paying registration, things like that. There can be more work done in that space, or reconsult with vet clinics, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and maybe supplying them some literature that they can give their clients. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Councillor Meehan.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Councillor Hancock's questioning around the preferred owner scheme. What I got from it was that you would have a discussion with the owner to understand that they have these things in place. So, in other words, they'd have a doggy bag ready to go for an overnight.
Yes, something to that effect would be the intention, yes. A plan in place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kate, Stacey and Ross. No further questions. Thank you for presenting this item. I'm going to move the recommendation that Council adopts the Palmerston North Control Policy as presented in 2, but Councillor Johnson's indicated an additional recommendation, so I'm going to go to you, Councillor Johnson. I might leave it to you if you want to second it, but I understand it's an additional recommendation, is it?
It is an additional recommendation, yeah.
Okay. Are you happy to second this or not?
Yes, I'm happy to second it.
Councillor Johnson.
Are you
and-
happy to second my additional recommendation since my second has just left the room?
I have read it, and yes, I am.
Thank you.
I won't leave you hanging. Oh, there's Tato. We'll do this together.
He's running back now. Okay.
It lapses because of a second.
Well,
Nah, just
you're left
joking.
behind
Just
dry,
joking, you
Councillor
Willie.
Wood.
Floor's yours, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I don't think this is too controversial. This is an attempt to respond to those submitters who raised what I thought were reasonable concerns about the conflict that's occurring now in the front of Linklater Park between its use as a dog exercise area for dogs off leash and its use also as a park and a place where children will play, people have barbecues, etc. So I thought that was a fair and reasonable concern that was raised, and I would like to see us look further into it, do an appropriate amount of engagement with the community to find out what the range of views are, and then report that back to the committee so that we can then make a decision on whether or not we want to go out and consult specifically on a change to the front part of Linklater Park. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that the character of Linklater Park has changed a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, it used to be just a bare field, basically, where it was appropriate to run your dog off leash. It's become much more developed with much better facilities for the community. We've had a lot of housing growth out that way in that time. And I think it's a reasonable thing to review whether or not we've got the settings right for dog exercise in the front park of Linklater Park. So not wanting to prejudice any outcome of any engagement or consultation, but just accepting that was, I thought, a legitimate concern that was raised with us, and I didn't want to see it lost or put on the back burner. So I do ask for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'll apologise, colleagues. I was expecting Councillor Meehan's questions to take an extra 20 seconds longer than they did. So thank you, Councillor Johnson, for persisting without me there. I just want to back up what Councillor Johnson's just said. She read my mind in terms of the recommendation putting forward. I agree that we don't want to predetermine what the result of engagement would be, but I certainly think that when we have the Kelvin Grove Community Association coming to us, including support from Ross Linklater, their concerns around the safety and usability of the space, particularly the images that were shown in our hearings. I recall seeing pictures of people with bloodied shoes and dogs that have been attacked on Palmerston North and Kelvin Grove Facebook pages from Linklater, many of which had gone unreported, because obviously when you get attacked by a dog, you don't have time in every case to swap details with the person whose dog it might have been. I think it showed that there was certainly concern in the community and a feeling in the community that it wasn't a safe space for all people to use. I certainly, for one, won't walk my small dog down there, and I know a lot of other people who won't. So I think it would be useful to go out to the community, engage and get their views on this, and then go through the consultation process which will be required to make that change to 20L, as well as the infrastructure treatment that might be required to make a delineation between those spaces. But given we've seen recently, well, goodness, in the first few months of the year, we've seen dogs attacked across the country in similar spaces to this, I think it would be appropriate for us to look at this work. So thank Councillor Johnson for putting it forward.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chair. I just really, I've reiterate the comments made by both the previous speakers in terms of Linklater. I fully support that. I guess probably my only comment that I want to make other than that is really just to urge officers, I think, to provide some clear guidelines in terms of what meets a standard now for the changes around preferred owner. And particularly around that sort of emergency contingency. At this point in time, I don't think it's reasonably defined at this point. So I think it needs to be done. I guess it's really about making sure that good owners can in fact actually attain that preferred owner status, and that the bar is actually set at a reasonable level and it's not doesn't become unattainable. So those are my comments. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I'm really happy with the proposed policy and the response that's been outlined in the paper, and I'm also really comfortable with the second recommendation. I just want to make a couple of comments about some of the other information or feedback that has come up through this process that is considered out of scope for this particular policy. I questioned around the compliance on dog on leash areas, and certainly have had plenty of experience with using those shared pathways in dog on leash areas where dogs are running quite free, not on leash. And very frequently when the dog runs up to me, the owner says, "Oh, it's okay, he's friendly." And I think there's many owners, dog owners in our city who think that if their dogs are friendly, that they're exempt from the rules. And I don't think that is the case, and certainly it doesn't protect people who are not comfortable for whatever reason with unknown dogs running up to them, barking or whatever. So as someone who has been bitten by a dog, that is something that I experience, and I think there are many people in our community who would prefer to have areas where they can walk, run, bike, where they can be sure that dogs are on leash if it's not on leash area. So that is obviously out of scope, but has been commented, and I think I'm not sure what the answer is in terms of compliance, but I think perhaps some better communication at some point to dog owners to ensure that those rules are for their dogs, whether they're friendly or not, might be really useful. The other feedback that has come up here, which is also considered out of scope, is perhaps calling for stricter enforcement and penalties for irresponsible dog owners. I think in the fees and charges paper recently, we missed an opportunity really to address this through that, because the revenue that we get from fees and charges for those who don't follow the rules is very small. I think it was about 20,000, and the officer's recommendations at the time was there to be no change. And the response in this paper also is no change, but that those comments have been referred to the officers for their consideration. I think at some point it would be good, particularly with the increasing dog registrations, and there's obviously feedback in the submissions on that also. It would be good to have an opportunity to look at whether it would be appropriate to increase the fees for those who are not following the rules, whether that be the next yearly report or whether that be a separate report. Certainly it's been referred to officers for their consideration, and I'd look forward to some opportunity to look at that at some stage in the future.
Thank you. Finally, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a brief comment. I'm certainly supportive of both of these. The second recommendation and kind of kicking off another process does have me thinking a little bit about the kind of balance of effort we put into pre-engagement and understanding the needs that actually exist and are actually quite manifest within the community before we go into a consultative process around a bylaw. And I do wonder if we had our time again, if we might have put a bit more emphasis around that space, and that could have actually surfaced this issue in a way that we could have gone through one process once rather than the same process twice. I also acknowledge that hindsight's a wonderful thing, but it does have me thinking about in future as we think about the range of bylaws and policies that we consult on, the relative emphasis on pre-engagement to surface issues so that we can have at least a reasonable chance as a table of sort of sorting it out once rather than having to drag it on twice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. There's no further members wishing to speak. I'll now invite a vote on both recommendations before us. Thank you. That is passed unanimously. Votes for. I'm going to move on to item 12 and invite Bryce Hoskins, Group Manager for Property and Resource Recovery, and Perini Green, Property Officer, to present the OP Place and Tui Park proposal to grant a lease on council land to the Kohanga Reo o Ngāti Hinioti ki Rangitāne o Manawatu Trust deliberations report. Yeah, we'll do this item first. I don't expect it to take too long.
Kia ora, councillors. In the spirit of getting to morning tea, I'm happy to take this report as read and take any questions.
Thank you. Open up the floor if there are any questions. Councillor Fitzgerald.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Bryce. So I'm certainly not opposed to this and support the applicant's proposal. I just couldn't find anything in the funding policy that spoke to such a significant development on a council-owned property being mitigated with any risk attached to the proposal. Obviously not going ahead, might go ahead in the space of the 10-year term. So I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on perhaps past projects of similar nature where any risk to council has been mitigated that includes a significant development.
I'm just trying to think of examples where we've had a significant development such as this going on council land that we haven't been responsible for delivering ourselves, and at the moment I'm currently striking a blank. Sorry, councillor.
Just a further question then, Bryce, if you wouldn't mind. There's no reference in the leasing arrangements as to when the proposed development might take place.
So we're currently treating this as a for-purpose organisation and simply leasing the land to them. Admittedly, for majority of those, they're things like scout halls and rugby clubs and the likes. So they are, a much more smaller one building type, pretty straightforward arrangements. And typically we don't seek that sort of information from them. We are usually abreast of the developments as they do them, and they tend to keep us in the loop, and we work with them on that. But essentially the risk of them not building their building or taking, say, 6 months to get going sits with the tenant. The lease commences straight away, and the rental is due immediately. So essentially, if they don't proceed or they take a long time to proceed, then that sits with them.
Wonderful. And just the last question on that point then, please, Bryce. Does the committee have an opportunity to bring this back to the table within the term of the first 10-year lease for any concerns such as delays in development?
If anything like that arises, I'm happy to bring something back in due course if required.
Cool. No further questions. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Thank you. The only question I had, Bryce, is just with their proposal to build new facilities on this, the capital investment required, just the term of the proposed lease where you've got the 10 and then 2 rights of 5, which in total was 20, whether or not there's been some deep consideration of 10 plus 10 plus 10, considering the investment cost of a new build?
The term of the lease has been discussed with the trust. With being that it is on reserve land, it cannot exceed 29 years. The trust was happy with the 20-year lease.
Okay, thank you. There's no further questions. Thank you for presenting this report. I'll move the recommendations before us. It's quite a mouthful. The committee grant lease of the land of both OP Place and Part Tui Park, Palmerston North, described as Lot 81, DP 24258 and Sec 1 of SO 452061, respectively to Kohanga Reo o Ngāti Hinioti ki Rangitāne o Manawatu Trust. in accordance with Council's support and funding policy in Section 54 of the Reserves Act 1977, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just want to say a word of support, really, for this. It's taken a long time to get to this part, and it's been, I guess, quite a bureaucratic process. But I don't want to lose sight of what stands to be achieved here, which I think is something really significant. It's very, very important if you want to maintain your language to be able to transmit it to the next generation. No language survives if it's not able to be transmitted to the next generation. And I think, across the whole of New Zealand, we've seen the success of the Kohangarea movement in terms of creating speakers of Māori and people who go on to become adult speakers of Māori as a result of their immersion in young years. So, I strongly support this application because I think if we don't provide practical and real support and assistance to make sure that Te Reo Māori is transmitted to the next generation, it is potentially at risk of being lost. So this is, I think, what's at stake here. It's transmission of language and with that culture, and it's very, very important. And we heard a lot of that in the submissions, and I think it's important when we're now here making the decision that we understand what's at stake here for the community. So I'm very supportive and just wanted to say those words. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no further speakers. I'm going to invite a vote. Thank you. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. I'm going to continue with the objective of getting all Part 1 items out before break and then call on Bryce to come back for item 13, which is 21 Havelock Ave, proposal to grant a licence to the Papaoia Pacifica Community Trust deliberations report, and also, that's Bryce, and also Perini Green. Ngā mihi.
Thank you, councillors, and apologies, I should have introduced my colleague. Perrine is our property officer here at council, so she's doing all the hard mahi around lease negotiations and putting a lot of this work together. So I thought I would put her in the hot seat with me to answer any questions. Much like the previous paper, this is essentially the last step 3 in the process where you're actually looking to grant a licence. Importantly, this is a licence, not a lease. Just by the nature of what it is, it's not a licence is more appropriate, but it doesn't materially change anything from this decision for your point of view. So happy to take questions.
Okay, open it up for any questions. There being none, thank you both. I'll move the recommendations before us that the committee grant a licence of the land of 21 Havelock Avenue, part of Bullground Park, Palmerston North, described as lot DP 40097 to Papaoia Pacifica Community Trust, in accordance with Council's support and funding policy in Section 54 of the Reserves Act 1977, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. Councillor Zebulon.
Thank you. I just as well would like to just acknowledge, I think it's delighting to see such support for an initiative like this, and such a delight to read through those submissions. Any initiative like this that gets food infrastructure in our city, particularly in the 412, and the skills enhancing education aspects of this and the community building has just been a delight to read through, and I wish them all the best and hope that this is successful. Please support. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you speak on behalf of all of us. There's no further speakers wishing to speak, so I'll now invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 13 votes for and none against. It moves us on to the following item, which is item 14. Bryce, I call you back. And Perrine, again, to come forward to present this item, which is on Park proposal to continue supporting Rose Garden Croquet Club Incorporated by notifying the public of intention to grant community occupancy via a lease of council land. Floor's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is step one in the process, where we're just seeking approval to go out for consultation on this lease. So you're not actually approving the lease today. I would just note that there's a slight modification to their land that they've had previously, as discussed in the report, but happy to take any questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Open it up. Councillor Wood.
Just the usual, Bryce. Why 5 years and 5 years, not 10 years and 10 years?
Yeah, as I think I've remarked before, standard sort of process we go through is 5 plus 5. That with a lot of these organisations, it's a nice sort of balance between giving them enough term to proceed with confidence if they're seeking funding or anything like that. But equally, from our point of view, it's not engaging for a huge length of time that might deter any sort of future decision making on land in the future.
So they're aware through the process if they wanted to request a longer term lease, they'd be able to do that, and they'll be made aware of that.
Absolutely, we have this discussion with them, and we talk through the terms prior to this paper coming to the council chamber.
Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions to you both. Thank you for presenting this item. I'll move as chair the recommendations before us that council continue to support the Rose Garden Croquet Club Incorporated by notifying the public of its intention to grant occupancy of council land on Ongan Park, Palmerston North, in accordance with the support and funding policy 22. And 2, that council note the land affected by the community occupancy of Rose Gardens Community Croquet Club Incorporated be described as Lot 2 DP 77988. Seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. There being none, I'd now like to invite a vote. Unanimously, 14 votes for. Item 15 is the work schedule, and there's no comments from officers, but open to any questions on the schedule. There being none, I'm happy to move that the Strategy and Finance Committee receive its work schedule dated May 24, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Any comments? I'd invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. Before we break for morning tea, I just want to move to part 2. So this is the exclusion of public, item 17, and it's item 18, the Ashurst 3 Bridge Loop Track. The reason for it being in part 2 is negotiations. For information needs to be kept confidential to ensure council can negotiate effectively, especially in business dealings. I'll move that. There's seconded by Councillor Naylor. Any discussion? I'd now like to invite a vote. Has 14 votes for, none against. We'll now adjourn for morning break, and when we come back, come into part 2, and we'll come back at 2:15.